If you'd like to talk about your own Bigfoot encounter, or if you're looking for help from a Bigfoot investigator in your area, email me at bigfootcrossroads@gmail.com. No Sasquatch were harmed in the recording of this podcast. Randy, welcome to Bigfoot Crossroads. How are you?
I'm good, Matt. I appreciate you having me on here. I've known about you for about, 10 or 12 years, and we just got in contact just a few days ago, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it seems like forever ago whenever I first heard of Randy Harrington. Back then, you were doing some poking around in Oklahoma, I believe. Are you originally from this area?
I was born in Little Rock, Arkansas, but I, don't have any memories of there because I left when I was quite young. Moved up around Kansas City, Kansas. So I'm about 3 hours north of the border. That would put me into Oklahoma, and almost all of my activity started. Well, first I was in northern Arkansas when I started in 2003, just looking on my own around the Mount Magazine area, and then met people and moved over into Oklahoma, and that's where it kind of stayed for a long time. I had no qualms about driving from Kansas City, down 35, 7 hours to get down to my places down in Oklahoma, whether it be the Comanche Mountains or, the Chickasaw Park. So it was always quite a drive for me, but I had an interesting job, which was fire department, and it gave me quite a bit of time off. Most of your 24-hour schedules, where you often have a day on, day off, day on, day off, day on, and then 4 days in a row off. Those type of schedules. So I would take those 4-day stretches and always get my way down to Oklahoma for a few days. So every 2 weeks I was down there, for the longest time. Oh my God, I've spent so much money chasing this hobby.
Why did you start going after Bigfoot? What kicked everything off for you?
Well, when I was young, I read a book. I read Roger Patterson's book. As a matter of fact, it was in my school library, and I was, I think, 7th grade when I read it, and it kind of floored me. I read it. It was a scary book to me because it was just a book full of encounters. Him recounting people's stories that he had learned over the years. We're talking 1950s and 1960s. I'm guessing, but I'm reading the stories from first-hand accounts from these stories from people. And it was so fascinating to me as a young person. I had no idea that it could even be possibly to fake it, because it just seemed so real and matter of fact. And so that was kind of the beginning of the seeds planted. And then, fast forward to years later, I get my first computer. And the reason I got my computer is because I was on the fire department, and, certain, as far as training and, getting college courses and stuff like that, you kind of needed your own computer. So once I got a computer, it allowed me to just kind of look around, and I was just, again, I was gobsmacked with how much information was out there about Bigfoot sightings, locations. And so that kind of started my plan at the time. I got on the fire department, I think 97. And then 2003, I'd planned a trip with a couple other firefighters. And, I was telling them about my fascination with Bigfoot. So we all bought 4-wheelers, and we rented a cabin down in southern Oklahoma. And I was the one who got to pick the cabin and find the location. And it was at the very south end of the Comanches. I think not Smithville, but there's just a small town that had some cabins right there. But anyways, so we went down there, and the gentleman who owned 4 or 5 cabins in the area, his name was Doug. And we paid him $50 a piece to take us on, and he started using GPS. So GPSs were relatively new at the time, and he had his 4-wheeler, and he had a trail mapped out of like a 50 or 60 mile trail through the Comanche Mountains that he would take people on, and they'd pay him $50 a piece, and we'd make a day trip out of it or something like that. So we did that, and of course I'm grilling him the whole way about Bigfoot, Bigfoot this, Bigfoot that, and we actually came across a rock on a trail as we're going through our stuff, and I've got a picture of it on my Facebook page where I'm standing there by this huge rock and it said Bigfoot 2001, and I'm like, Doug, what is it? What's going on here? Who put that on there and why? And he says, well, somebody probably had a sighting here, and he said that he's never seen one. And this was back in 2003. He said he's never seen one himself, but he has lots of friends who claims to have seen one. He's got friends that work in the timber industry down there, which is a thriving industry. And he says, my friends who said they've seen them, I have no reason to not believe them. So that we just kind of left it at that. But at that point, I was like, by God, if they're here, I've got to see one. That's all there is to it. I've got to see one. And I've got some OCD tendencies. I'm a business owner and I'm a perfectionist, and my business does well. So all of those are contributed to my OCD. But now I'm transferring that OCD tendencies into finding a Bigfoot. So you can understand how I cross every T and dot every I, and no holds bar in how much money I spend, which gets ridiculous at times. And and my wife would certainly attest to that. But here I am. I wanted to see one. It took me till 2006 after I met a man down in the Comanches. I think it was the first time that they had the Honebi Festival, and I got there on the last day. So I got there after it was shut down. And I was disappointed that I couldn't get there any faster. So there's nobody there. The festival was over. And so I'm just out on the trails one night, and I had bought me some not thermal, but night vision goggles that you drop down. You have them on a head harness, and you can drop them down and look through them they look like binoculars.
Yeah.
And so I'm riding the trails on my ATV with the headlights off, just looking with those glasses in the dark. And I come up on way up out of Honebi, up on a ridge somewhere. I come up on this car and some people on this, kind of camping there out of their car. And I'm just assuming that they're there for Bigfooting, because that's why I was there. And so I immediately start talking to them. Hey, you guys heard anything? You hear any knocks or anything going on? And I saw the dude look at his wife, and they were like, yeah, we've heard a couple knocks over here. And so that then the conversation was on. They truly were there for Bigfooting, and they were Bigfoot aficionados. And well, come to find out, the gentleman's name was Keith Perry. And that's how I met Keith.
Oh, wow.
So we became friends. As a matter of fact, I actually bought a second ATV so that he could have one. So because we needed two, so I bought another ATV. So whenever I go get him, and then he lived in Falls Valley, so I would come down 35 from Kansas City, pick him up, and then go 3 hours over into the Comanches all the time. I mean, that's the kind of person I am. I give and give and give, and so. We had this relationship, and he was always telling me about the stuff that was happening at the Chickasaw Park. And I would even ask him, I'd be like, well, if you got that much stuff going on there, what are you doing over here in the Comanches? And he says, well, they're a lot. He said, they're wilder here. And, I didn't know anything about them. So it makes sense to me. I mean, we're in the mountains and there's no, settlements around. So they must be wilder there. But I'd always planned on going to the Chickasaw Park because he was telling me these fantastical stories from the Chickasaw Park. He said that he and his wife based all of their research out of campsite 30 at Rock Creek. Now you got to understand, I don't know anything about this park, and I didn't even see it on a map or nothing. These are just stories. And he's telling me about other people that research the park and other groups, and people that find a lot of tracks on Guy Sandy. And after speaking with you the other day, I realized you may have been part of one of the groups that he was talking to me about.
Yeah, probably without a doubt.
Yes. So it's quite interesting that here we are, coming full circle where you and I are now having a discussion, even though we heard about each other back then without even knowing our names. So anyways, so he's telling me all of these things in fall of 2005. We'd been going there many, many times, and we picked this one spot up on the ridge, which is a couple ridges south of Honubby. And because one time we were looking for a spot where I had a close tree knock situation, I mean, a very close, loud tree knock that happened right after my tree knock. So we were trying to get back to that location, which was west of Honubby in some flat areas. But it had rained quite a few days, so it was so muddy we couldn't really get to the spot where I had my close bee encounter. So we just kind of drove around until we found a high spot that we could stay dry in, and so that's how we ended up on that ridge. We created a campsite that wasn't there before, and so we were there many, many times. Had lots of things happening, rocks throws like that, and he was seeing. Keith was more knowledgeable than I was, at the time. And so he'd be like, Randy, he said, I'm seeing, he said, you got to learn to look through your peripheral vision. He said, they're not going to move when you're looking at them. You got to kind of catch them moving when you're looking away. So you got to work on your peripheral vision. So he says, I'm noticing movement up over here. So it was actually across the road and higher up. And so that's where this figure eventually comes through, that we catch on video. So, and the way we caught that is we just had a camera setting up facing that side of the road and just letting it run all afternoon into the evening. So it ran for like 7 or 8 hours. And we were just down on the other side of the tents, down towards the back side of this campsite that dropped into a holler, canyon, valley, whatever. And I was doing tree knocks, just every 3 minutes doing single knocks. And I was also using my stick like a bat, and I was tossing up rocks and just aiming for the cheap seats,
Yeah.
So I was making all kinds of knocking noises throughout this early day. Well, needless to say, we don't know if anything got on film until later when Keith was at home going over the video. And he was like, man, we got one. There's 11 seconds of something coming up over the ridge and checking us out and then dropping back. And so we were very excited. And we sent it to, at the time, MK Davis was one of the best people to send something to examine. Maybe he's made it to where he's not that kind of person now. I don't know. But back then, that's the kind of person you'd send your video to is, man, can you clean this up for us? Can you look at it and tell us what's there? And he actually sent us back an email that had a clip of it, and you could see that it was brown. Whatever it was brown from head to toe. But of course, it was so pixelated because he had to zoom in quite a bit to get to it. But he said yes, it's something bipedal. It's completely brown from head to toe, and that just really added to our excitement. And when I tell people, you really have to believe that when you send if you're a hoaxer, you have no idea who you're sending that video to and what technology they have to decipher that and to look into it. So almost, if I hear somebody sending their video to anybody who can do anything with it, to me, that almost guarantees they're not hoaxing, because it would be quite embarrassing if you are trying to hoax somebody and you don't know what they're going to uncover in that video.
Right.
So we were very happy that he came back with that analysis, and he says it will open itself up to other analysis because of what he did on the clip. Needless to say, that was all great, but it was shortly after that, I actually, on another trip, I took Keith home, and it was in February. So I took Keith home from the Comanches after a camping trip, and I was just going to spend the night at the camp where he had all of his activity at Campsite 30. So I dropped him off at his home, at Paul's Valley, and then I went down to the park, and I'd never been there before. So I get there, 7, 8 o'clock, and I pull into the front area, and it's in the off season, so there's no camp host, there's no nothing. They didn't even have the things. They had the thing where you put money in a slot,
right,
to pick your campsite. So very low tech, and so I went to Campsite 30, and then I came back out. I set up my tent. Basically all I had was my tent and a table, and I threw some food on the table, and then I left and went to town to grab me something to eat. It was already starting to get dusk. So I got me something to eat, And my plan was, really, it's kind of crazy because of all that I had read about that park, what I knew about that park. I mean, I read about somebody coming out of the restroom, and I think it may have even been a Davis newspaper article where somebody came out of the restroom and something knocked her over running by, covered in hair or something to that effect. So with all of those in my I think of me with OCD, I've already planned everything out, and I've seen almost every outcome of how this can work, if it works or if it doesn't work. So my plan was to tape. Oh, I also read a report that somebody had went to see a movie somewhere, whether it was in Davis or somewhere, and they came back to camp around 11 o'clock at night or so, and something ran out of their campsite. So with that in my mind, I'm thinking, so they are visiting campsites, and I've got to make the campsite look like nobody's there. So if I want to get the same reaction, if I want to get one to visit my campsite, it's got to be a campsite, but they can't know that anybody's there. So my plan was to tape up blankets on the inside of my truck windows so that anything looking at my truck from a distance, it would just look like an empty truck. They couldn't see through the glass. They couldn't see anything. It would just be dark. And so I had it to where I could open up the blankets in front of the steering wheel, and I had it to where I could open up the blankets just to my driver's side. So I'm driving through the park through that crookedy one-way road, close to the trees, with just peeking it through the blankets that I had split right over my steering wheel. So I got into my parking spot, and never even opened the door. I just shut off the engine, and I'm sitting there quiet. So I eat my Sonic food. It's getting dark. I'm just sitting there listening, through the parabolic, and you hear, the wind was rustling a little bit. You got your nighttime sounds. You can certainly hear, some of the water running from that location. You could hear the trickle of the water in the Rock Creek. So there's this cadence to the nighttime sounds that, kind of is very melodic. And, anybody who listens to a parabolic in a tent knows what I'm talking about. You could even fall asleep to the cadence and, of just the sounds that, they all fit together. And then all of a sudden there's a noise that doesn't fit. And it was something walking through leaves. I heard it stepping through leaves, crunch, crunch, crunch. And I perked myself up. And, it could have been 11 o'clock at that point. It could have been midnight. I can't really be specific on knowing exactly what time it was. But it was much later into the evening. And I'm hearing footsteps. Something's walking through the leaf litter in the park. And this was February 2nd, I believe, 2nd or 3rd, something like that. I think it was a Tuesday night, maybe, in the off season. So, I already know I'm the only one there. So I'm hearing footsteps, and then I hear it must leave the leaf litter and cross one of the rock paths. Now, remember, I've never been in this park before other than me driving in there those 2 moments and setting up and then leaving and coming back. So I really did not know the lay of the land. I didn't know how everything was set up. And I hadn't really done much camping other than primitive camping in the Comanches at that point. So I really was unfamiliar with campsites in general. So I didn't know that each campsite was connected by these rock pathways that went to the restrooms and stuff like that. But I heard when it would leave the leaf litter, I would hear something dragging through gravel. So it was dragging a stick. And then I would hear it enter leaf litter again. And so then I would not hear it dragging through gravel. So I'm assuming it's dragging it even while it's walking through the leaves. I just can't hear it. I can only hear it when he's dragging it through the gravel. Because every time it would cross a gravel path, I would hear the stick dragging, but not when I was hearing just the footsteps in the leaves. So in my head, my OCD brain is seeing it exactly as how I'm hearing it. And then I hear the first metal get hit. And come to find out, it has to be the lantern posts. Mm-hmm. Because I hear a ding and then a continuation of all the sounds I'd heard before of just movement, dragging the stick, crossing rock. And then I hear another ding. And I'm like, it's hitting lantern post as it passes them. And so I can't help be getting excited. I mean, I'm at a campsite where someone has told me these things are there. There's a little one. He talked about a little one that is fond of his wife. He said, and his wife had bright red hair and she was loud. She's a loud woman. So I can only imagine a little one taking an interest in a Keith Perry's wife,
Yeah.
So for that reason alone. So anyways, so I'm there with all of his stories going on in my head while I'm having something happening that was pretty profound at that moment. I didn't know how it was going to transpire. Eventually, at that point, it was still pretty awesome what I was even hearing because I knew I was recording it. And anyways, we'll get to my recordings later. It was a nightmare. I had one of those little micro cassette recorders. Remember, this was the beginning of my research. You talk about somebody that would buy some lame ass equipment. I had a little micro cassette recorder that had the little teeny tiny tape that were only like 5 minutes long, and you were constantly having to flip them over. And I had like 7 or 8 of them in the seat, and in the dark, I eventually got to where I was using the same ones over and over again, not knowing that I didn't have them set off to the side. So I kept putting the same ones back in and trying to record. So it was a nightmare. But anyways, so it's going through the park, and then I hear the first trash can lid. I hear the concrete block being moved and a lid pop open and the lid pop back on and the concrete block set back on the lid.
Wow.
And I know that's what I'm hearing. So I'm like, oh my God, there's something looking in the trash. Now, it could be a person. It could be a person. It was cold. Let's just say there's a bum or a homeless person or a vagrant or something. But even somebody that lives in Sulphur would have to know that nobody's camping down there in the off season. There wouldn't be anything in the trash cans.
Yeah.
And it would be a waste of time. And it was a cold night. So all of those things in my mind, I'm trying to go over all the details, and I'm like, it can't be a person. There's no way this is a person. Now, granted, I only learned later about Dr. Charles Hallmark and his baiting of those trash cans in the off season, which what he set up clearly is why I had my encounter. So whatever it is meandering through the park from trash can to trash can, because then I hear the hitting of the lantern post, the dragging the stick, and then it gets to the next trash can, pops the lid off, pops the lid back on, and then meanders through the park, gets to its third trash can. And so at this time, I have a pretty clear picture of what's happening. And then it stops. For the first time, it stopped. And what I didn't know is it had come down on that lower road that runs parallel to Rock Creek there and come in behind campsite 30 there, which is where I was parked. So it's lower. That little road is a little bit lower than where the campsite sits. So I can imagine him walking and having to get pretty close before he all of a sudden sees somebody in campsite 30 from that lower road. And he stops. And that's the first time I heard him stop. And so I'm like, he sees me. And I'm listening intently, and I hear it move a few steps and stop. And it was never on the pavement. It was always in brush, because I was hearing the steps in crackling dead leaf sounds. So it was moving and stop. And then it would move again and stop. Excuse me. So in my mind, I'm thinking he's moving from tree to tree. He's stalking my campsite. That's what it sounds like. And so I start parting my blankets, and I'm looking out, and I think logically that these things have to be smart, so it would probably approach from the rear. Now, I don't know why I got lucky that way, but I did. So I'm looking down my side mirror, which I can see there's a big tree right behind my truck right there before that road drops down. And I see this thing look around that tree. And it's just a single animal or a single creature. There wasn't 2 of them at that time. There was only one. And it put both hands on the side of the tree and looked out around the tree on the roadside as you turn up to my campsite. So I saw him step out and then step back behind the tree, like he looked out and then went back. And oh my God, my heart was racing like you wouldn't believe at that point, because I'm like, he's right there behind my truck, and I saw him, and so now I know where to look. I'm glued in on looking at that spot, and for the first time, I hear a wood on wood knock. It hit probably that tree that it was standing behind, but it hit a tree. So it had a stick already in its possession. Now, most of what I tell from all this stuff that happens afterwards is me either speculating or talking to other people and coming up with patterns and things like that. But at this point, I don't know what size the animal, the creature is that I'm looking at, because I only see one and I don't have anything really to compare it to for size. So it looks human as far as its shadowy look with the head and shoulders and the arms. It just looks human. And then it hits the tree, and I hear a splashing coming across Rock Creek. And so I'm thinking to myself, here comes, there's something coming. There's something wading through the water. And I don't see anything because I'm still looking at that tree, and I'm staring at that tree because I just assume that that's where he's still at. And so I don't see how it gets approached by the second one or anything. But then I get 17 owl calls in a row that were about every 5 seconds apart. And they got louder each time. I learned later, I never even told Charles Hallmark when I had a discussion with Charles Hallmark about it. He was telling me about his studies there. And he says there's 2 clusters. And he said the ones around Rock Creek use owl calls. And he said the ones at Guy Sandy use whoops to locate each other and stuff. And when he said that, I said, "Oh God, I forgot to tell you, I got him hooting for like 17 times in a row before they stepped out. I never heard a hoot before that. Never heard a hoot afterwards. It's amazing."
My mind's just, you have to understand. I know your story. I heard your story years and years and years ago. But like sitting here listening to it again after all these years, I mean, you're talking about a campsite I have spent hours in, hours and hours, like weeks on end in that campsite. I know the tree you're talking about. I know the exact location. I've experienced things in that campsite as well. I've experienced the owl calls that, don't really sound like owls, and they're, walking across the road down in the distance and stuff. I mean, all this stuff is just,
I will send those. I've got 7 of those 17 calls that I was able to save, and I've got them to where I can send those to you so you can hear them.
Yeah, sorry, keep going. It's just, it's just one of those moments, where it's like
that you're there with me.
Yes, 100%.
Okay, well, it gets better. Okay, so I kind of know where they're at. I'm hearing these owl calls. After the 17th one, I mean, I don't even know enough about animal life and birds and stuff to know that that's natural or not. I just know that that's when it was happening, when they were right there behind that tree. So, and then all of a sudden, that's it. There is no more owl calls. And they come out. There's 2 of them. That's the first time I see that there's more than one. And there was a big one and a little one. So now I'm assuming, through all of my years of thinking about this over and over again, that it was the little one going through the park, not the big one. It was the little one acting like a kid, dragging that stick, banging the metal post, doing all these things that you would expect a kid to do. This thing was doing it just like a human child would be doing. He was there on a mission, though. Clearly, the big one sent him over there to check the trash cans. What I didn't know, some of this information I didn't learn until later about Charles Hallmark baiting the trash cans in the off season. And I told him whatever was in the park was going from trash can to trash can. And he said, I haven't baited those trash cans for 2 years. So he was trying to get fingerprints from his technique there of them going into the trash cans. And it's been 2 years because he got sick. He'd been sick and lost a bunch of weight. And as a matter of fact, he died shortly after our phone call. So he was on the tail end of being sick. And so he said, it's been 2 years since I baited those trash cans. He says, they're still in there looking for my baits. And so, but at that point, after a 2-year drought of no baits in the trash can, the big one was like, I'm going to send you over there, Junior. Just let me know if there's something in there so I can come over. But until then, you just do it for me. But the youngster never hit a tree until he was ready for the big one to join him. He only hit metal posts. And I never heard any sloshing in the creek every time a metal lantern post was hit. But the moment he hit that tree, here comes the big one. That means they talked about it. Here's our plan. You see something that needs my attention, hit a tree. Because the kid never hit a tree before then. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
So
I have to wonder if the pinging on the lantern post was kind of a locator thing.
Maybe.
Let him know where I'm at in the park.
Exactly. Maybe he was following on the backside of Rock Creek.
Yeah.
On that Indian that where they built that casino thing or whatever that that center is. So maybe it was paralleling on that side of the creek while it was going through the park. So he was letting that one know where he was just by dinging on the metal post. But when he got behind my truck, he hit the tree for the first time, and because the crossing of the creek was so immediate. And it was right there at the back of my truck where he crossed Rock Creek. That means he was probably following down on the backside of that creek while the little one was going through the park.
Yeah, it makes sense. There's I don't know if it's still there. It was years ago, sort of a retirement home on the opposite side of the creek once you go into the Rock Creek campgrounds.
Yes.
And they were known to raid that dumpster behind it at times on the opposite side of the creek.
Yes, I mean, if there was no foliage on the tree, you could probably see that infirmary, old folks' home.
Yeah.
From that campsite, that's I'm sure it was probably 200 or 300 yards away.
Not far at all.
Yeah. That just fascinating. So after the owl calls, that's when they must have thought to themselves, okay, we don't see anybody moving in the tent. That must have been them seeing if they could get somebody to arouse themselves in the tent. So they come out of the tree line. The big one was in the lead. He was stooped over. His arms were swinging, and they were moving at a pretty good clip. And they made a beeline from that location to the back corner of my truck, driver's side corner of my truck. Now, that put the truck between them and the tent. They positioned themselves where they had something between where their perception of danger would be, which would be in the tent. And the big one stayed right at that corner, which gave me a full-bodied view of him. I saw the way he moved coming from the tree line, stooped over, facing me, arms swinging, and the little one was flanking him right at his hip. Matter of fact, bumping into his hip as they were both trying to get to that back corner at the same time. And then the little one moved in behind the tailgate. I never saw him again because he dropped down behind the tailgate. But the big one was standing right there on the driver's side back corner of my truck, and he put his hands on the bar, my ladder racks. I had a diesel truck, a crew cab diesel truck with ladder racks on the back. And so his left hand grasped the back corner bar, and his right hand grabbed the cross beam across the back that the ladder would set on. And at that point, he was standing up straight as backbone as you and I. And he was looking over the racks towards the tent. And I could see a nervousness in his demeanor, where he was almost ready to duck and very much keeping an eye on the tent. So they had no idea I was in the truck. They clearly had no idea because the tent was their focus. I had that table full of food. They never once, stepped out to molest that table full of food. That was not their interest. I don't think food is as much of an interest to them as people think. But they, and what happened next was really a conglomeration of me having thoughts going through my head at the same time things were happening, and me trying to figure out what's happening and still going through all this fear processes in my head. And that is, I thought he was coming down the driver's side. There was a moment that he moved in a way that made me think that he was ducking down and moving up towards the cab. And dude, I went through a panic at that moment. I mean, a pure panic, because my doors were not locked. People are like, "What? How you could possibly go Bigfoot and not lock your doors? Make sure your doors are locked." Well, at that point, I've been doing it for 3 years, and you come up dry almost 99% of the time. So you really didn't expect anything to even happen this night. And locking my doors really wasn't on my mind until that moment where I saw something with hands. And so I'm kind of in a real panic mode at that point. I mean, to where I'm borderline heart attack. I mean, my heart's racing, and and I remember putting my head down, and I could feel my shirt between my chest muscles pumping with my heart. The shirt was moving with my heartbeat, and I'm thinking, he's touching my truck. I said, I can feel my heartbeat. I can feel my seat moving from my heartbeat. And I'm like, he can feel my heart beating through the metal of this truck. If he's touching this truck, he knows I'm in here. That was my thoughts anyways. So I pulled my back off my seat because I was like, man, I just don't want him to know I'm in here. And then within a second, he was not coming down the driver's side, but I already had the windows closed. I mean, the blankets dropped closed, where I'm just sitting there behind my A post, hunkered down in the shadowy part of the truck, thinking the worst. And almost immediately, the ass end of my truck squats down. So I go from the pure panic of thinking he's just going to be two inches away from me outside of the glass of my truck window to now I know where he's at. But I was equally as panicked because I thought he was in the bed of my truck because it squatted down. What I didn't know until the next day of looking over everything that had happened and looking at the evidence, he was standing on my bumper. He wasn't in the bed of my truck. But in my defense, I'm thinking, oh my God, he's in the bed of my truck. And my truck was pretty new at the time. It was a 2004. And I was thinking, if he climbs on the cab of my truck, it's going to crush. The whole cab is going to crush in. And I had no reason to believe that he wasn't going to climb on the cab of my truck because I thought he was in the bed of my truck. I'm like, why would he climb in the bed of my truck? So I actually put my hand on my key, and my heart is racing because I'm thinking, if I have to start, if it appears to me that he's climbing on the cab of my truck, I'm starting my truck up and I'm getting out of here, and he's going to be in the bed of my truck.
Yeah. Everybody's having a heart attack.
Right, man. I mean, so I've got these thoughts going through my head, and I'm panicking, and I'm on the brink of about to start my truck up, and if they didn't know I was in there now, they're certainly going to know once I start the truck up. I mean, and I could only imagine the chaos after that. But I didn't have to do that because almost immediately I heard him rummaging through the back of my truck. So I knew at this point he was interested in all of my camping supplies in the back of my truck. He wasn't getting on my cab. I still thought he was in the bed of my truck. I didn't know he was standing on the bumper until I saw the dusty footprints the next day. So I'm, in my mind, he's in the bed of my truck digging through all of my supplies. I had a generator back there. I had Tupperware containers. I had 2 propane tanks, sitting back in there, the little green propane tanks. And anyways, all of a sudden, the noises of them kind of rummaging through my stuff stops when the 2 green propane tanks get knocked together. I'm hearing movement, shuffling, just stuff moving, and then clank, and then everything stopped. And then I hear clank, 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 like something was toying with the 2 tanks at the sound that it made when they touched each other. I'm only assuming that it's the little one because the little one ducked down behind the tailgate, remember, with his hands on top of the tailgate. So all he had to do was stand up and he'd be looking right down at those 2 tanks. So, but also what I don't realize until the next day is where the two footprints were on the bumper, which was the big one, which was on each side of the bumper. So his foot was all the way from one side of the truck to the other on the bumper. And he was big enough that he could have easily just leaned over and just reached over the racks and easily had access to everything in the back of my truck. He didn't have to be in the bed of my truck. He could do all this just from the bumper. So, and also I got a size reference because the next day, because I saw him standing right next to my ladder racks where he was neck and head taller than my racks, I was able to measure my racks from the ground, and it was 7 foot. So he was neck and head taller than 7 foot. So the big one was 8.5 foot tall. The little one was about 5.5 foot tall. I'm assuming it was the little one that took an interest in the metal tanks that were clanking together just because of its location on the back passenger side of the bed right there next to the tailgate. And that's where he was standing. So I'm assuming that he's the one who clanked them together and was like, hey, this is cool, Dad, because they took them.
Took the tanks.
Yes, the tanks were gone.
And were these full tanks, empty tanks?
Yes, they were full. The little green ones, they were full. And I heard them clanking them together as they were leaving. It's like, imagine the little one with one in each hand, just enjoying the sound of them clanking together.
Yeah.
That's what I was heard as they were leaving.
The same little one that was whacking the lantern post with the stick. Most likely that's what it was doing.
Yeah, even though I didn't see that part, I'm just telling you what I heard.
Right.
So I'm imagining the little one with these tanks like, that's a cool sound, Dad.
I mean, in this campground, every single campsite has one of those metal lantern posts. So if you spend any time there, it's not hard to figure out what that sound most likely would be, hearing it, advance towards your location. I'm just saying that for the benefit of the listeners.
Well, and for the benefit of the listeners, while I'm sitting in my truck, I still don't know the green tanks are gone. To be honest with you, when I was hearing those metal sounds as they left, I'm still hunkered in my truck, and I am not getting out till daylight. Because I'd never know if they're completely gone, if they're still out there somewhere. I actually sat there till daylight. I did not get out of my truck. So when I heard the metal thing, you got to understand, I didn't know the green tanks were missing. I'm assuming they're hitting lantern posts again. I didn't know until the next day, when as soon as it's daylight, I get out and I start looking around. I'm looking for fingerprints. I'm looking for hair on my ladder racks. And I see the dusty footprints on my bumper. So that tells me where he was actually standing when I was scared he was in the. And then I look in the back of the truck. My generator was turned over. It flipped over my generator, and the 2 tanks were gone. And that's when I made the connection. Those were the metal sounds I heard as they were leaving.
I mean, just brings back so many memories.
I know every time I tell a story, and believe me, I've told it 100 damn times. And,
I'm sure.
I'm sure. And I know people get tired of hearing it, but you know what? Not a day goes by that I don't have it cross my mind in some fashion.
I mean, I've told the majority of stories I have of things I've experienced in that park, but one of the main stories I talk about is the time that the lanterns at that campsite got turned off in the middle of the night, and I heard something trying my door handle parked from the sound of it exactly at the same spot your truck was parked that night.
Wow.
So the idea of like you hunkered down that truck with the doors unlocked.
Right. Yes.
I mean, my doors were locked. Can
you imagine if he'd have popped open my driver's door and I'm sitting there looking at him like, what are we going to do now?
Hi.
and I tell people I had a gun and I had a camera, but my plan, I was so determined to follow my plan that even when they left with those tanks, I was still waiting for my plan to come to fruition. And that was, I was not going to reveal that I was in the truck. That's why I sat there till daylight. I wanted them to come back. I wanted them to realize that nobody's there. We can go back. We can do whatever. But my goal was at some point, I said, if they come into my campsite, they have to go to the front of my truck. And my plan, I had the camera ready to go. And I'd even practiced turning on my headlights to make sure that I could turn on my headlights without starting up the engine. And I found out, yes, I can do that. So my plan was that if they ever broached the front of my truck area, I was just going to hit record on my camera and turn on my headlights and catch them in my headlight beams.
Simple plan.
That was my only plan. And
simple plan.
And my determination, no matter what else happened, was to weighed out my plan because I thought it had a relatively chance of success. But fact is, they came and left towards the rear of my truck, never once coming to the front. But if they'd have come to the front, then we'd be having a whole different story with some really good evidence.
We have 2 instances in the same park at the same location of these things messing with vehicles of campers being parked there at this point.
Yes.
So how often do they do this? I mean, this has to be something that they know they can get away with.
Yes, of course, I've gone back there a million times, especially the few years right after that. I mean, I was going back there all the time, and I sent you some of the evidence that I've collected from the park. Lots of anecdotal evidence, a lot of, picture evidence, especially the game cam pictures, that I think was the young one coming into my campsite. So there's some good stuff. So there's lots of times I was there that I will talk to other people. I was coming up out of the creek one time, and I often wear my fire department sweatshirt because it makes people feel very comfortable when they see somebody with a fire department sweatshirt on, if I'm asking questions or anything like that. So anyways, I'm coming up out of the creek one morning, and I'm just looking for footprints, and there was an older gentleman and an older lady walking down the park. A lot of people use that park for their exercise. And man, he had to have been 80 years old. I mean, he was quite elderly, and his wife was about 10, 12 feet behind him, and he was going along at a pretty good clip. So as I come out, he looked over and saw me, and he was like, "What are you doing, young man?" And I said, "Oh, I'm just looking for footprints." And he stopped, and he goes, "What kind of footprints are you looking for?" And I said, "Well, no point in beating around the bush." I said, I had an encounter here in 2006, and I said, "I'm still here looking for evidence." And he looked back at his wife, and she had stopped also, and she said, "Go ahead, tell him." And he goes, "I saw one." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Where?" He said, "I come here at 6 o'clock every morning. I walk these trails, and I do this." And he said, "I saw one on the trail one time, and it walked off into the woods ahead of me." So there's an anecdotal story from somebody that had no reason to either lie or tell me. And you could tell that his wife was of the mindset that she was tired of hearing it. She was probably tired of hearing it, just like my wife's tired of hearing it.
I mean, well, you mentioned the lady being knocked down as she came out of the restrooms.
Yes.
So at the time, any calls that went through police dispatch, it's an extremely small town, a couple small towns next to each other, separated by 7 miles, I think, on the highway. Anytime a call came through the dispatch calls would get printed in the next day's newspapers.
Oh.
And that was one of the calls that came in from the park. A woman had gone into the restroom, and she came out, and all she remembers is something big and hairy, a big hairy arm knocking her to the ground and something taking off running into the brush. Another gentleman was walking the trails and reported that he got attacked by what he called a gorilla. He was afraid because there was a gorilla on the loose in the park, and he, I believe this was walking Rock Creek there underneath Bromide Hill at the front of the park. But I think he was on farther in to what would be the east end of the opening of the park. And he said it was around dusk or whatever, and he was walking down the trail, and all of a sudden he just looked up, and there was a gorilla standing there, and it attacked him, knocked him down, and took off into the woods.
Wow.
The thing you mentioned about the people returning back to their camp and seeing one around camp, I'm pretty sure I was standing there whenever they reported that to the park ranger on duty that evening.
Wow.
From campsite 30, they were one campsite over towards the opening of the park. So they were separated by brush and woods and everything, but they were having a family reunion, and they had been gone messing around or whatever, and they came back to camp, and there were so many of them that they had taken multiple vehicles and stuff, and they were getting ready to go somewhere, or just returning and going towards their tent or something, and they heard some noises coming from one of the other tents, and They just thought it was one of the kids in their group trying to pull a prank or whatever. And so they started to walk towards this tent where it was going on, the commotion. And the tent was situated where the opening to it was facing away from the other tents towards the woods. And as they approached the tent, they said that someone, now in fairness, they'd never said Bigfoot or creature or anything like that. They said someone ran out of the tent and took off into the woods and just kept running. And they've never seen anybody run that fast. And whenever they gave the description of the person, they said, well, it appeared to be a large man wearing some sort of hooded jumpsuit that was all the same color. It was kind of like a light beige color.
Wow.
And, me and Chad, he was there at the time. We just kind of looked at each other and like, did you just, hear that?
Well, it sure is great to hear such a history of pattern behavior there that might still be going on, which I hope to find out pretty soon. One time, I ended up buying a camper because my wife and daughters, I actually took them to the Comanches a couple of times and had a couple of incidents happen where they were no longer interested in doing the primitive stuff that was way out away from society. It quite scared them. And it was that close tree knock that I was telling you about. So I bought a camper, and, you can't put a camper in Rock Creek. So the closest place I could go camping there with my wife and daughters was, we swam in Veterans Lake there, where you can jump off that little rock area. And we camped out by Lake Arbuckle. And we got out there and set the camp up. And me, I immediately got to go talk to the camp host and ask him about any Bigfoot stuff. And so I'm down talking to the camp host, and I said, hey, man, I'm just going to get to the point. In 2006, I had an encounter up at Rock Creek. I'm always interested in this subject. You being a camp host, can you tell me anything? Do you know of anything? And he said, you missed it by one day. I said, missed what? He said, midnight last night. He said, there's a long walkway from the park area where somebody has to walk down to that campsite that's down in that cove up there by Arbuckle. And he said there was two women with about 6 kids, 2 women with, 2 or 3 kids of each that were in this campsite of various ages. And he said around midnight, one of them came up and was pounding on his camper door and said there was a prowler around their campsite. And he went down there. And he said, this was like 2014, 2015. And he said he went down there and was looking with his flashlight through that cove, coming around the wooded cove. And he said you could see all of these spider webs in the trees that were broken in this path where something come around the shore of that cove up to their campsite, was peering into their campsite. They said whoever it was in that gully area looking into their campsite, didn't have a flashlight. And he said, I think I probably know what it was. He said, believe me, I've heard talk around here. He said, but we always have to assume it's a person. And so he said, we called a camp ranger. They came out, went down there, looked around, and we had all the people come up to the road, and, they did their investigation, and they just had to write it up as either a prowler or a suspicious person, or and so I thought that was interesting.
So, Lake Arbuckle, Buckhorn Loop, same area you're talking about. I also talked to some camp hosts there who one time told me about it was the middle of the night, around 3:00 in the morning. And something, nobody ever got a visual of it, but something walked through the camp or along the edge of the camp on the backside screaming. Just every few seconds, it would let out this horrendous scream, woke everybody in the campgrounds up. People were coming out of their tents, looking around, trying to figure out what's going on. Total chaos. A bunch of people left. But again, no visual sighting, no confirmation of what it was. Could have been a person.
Yeah. Well, the camp host that I talked to, he actually said that he got a big clump of reddish brown hair from an overhang. He said, I came in, unlocked the gates, come in, and was setting everything up for the beginning of the season. And he said, I'm walking around the restroom the bathroom and the shower area. And he said, there's a big clump of hair on the gutter at the end of the building.
I mean, people, I'm sure there's listeners out there who are hearing us talk about this Mecca, this Garden of Eden of Bigfoot activity. And there's just no way. We're not talking about, hiking out into the wilderness and, just camping on the ground or anything. We're talking about campsites with people. Tourism is huge at this place.
Right. And it never gets there's no easier camping than there is at Rock Creek because you're 2 minutes away from a Sonic. You're 2 minutes away from a Taco Bell.
It's a national park, but it literally sits at the very edge of a community, a town. Right. Multiple restaurants, fast food places, convenience stores, Walmart.
Hey, when I send you the audio to those owl calls, you're going to hear tires squealing from the town where some teenage boys, it's around midnight, on whatever night, and you hear when the light turns green, they do some tire squealing as they take off, and that's on the recorder too, while the Bigfoots were hooting at me. So just, how is it possible? How can there be this many people, all of this activity? But here we are. This is the first time we've really talked in the past 10, 15 years that we've known of each other. And we're hearing the same stories and experiencing the same things at the same location. I got one more for you. Yeah, I got one more story that you probably have not heard. One time I was there, and I would often go down there by myself, and I'm in town eating breakfast one morning, and I've got my fire department shirt on, and the waitress comes over, and she's like, wow, you're a long ways from home, because it says Leavenworth, Kansas, fire department. She goes, wow, you're a long ways from home. I said, well, you know me. I said, you have no idea what I'm doing here, do you? And she's like, well, what are you doing here? I said, I'm Bigfoot researching. And, because I don't care. I've got my best stories from opening up my big mouth and just saying what needs to be said. And she goes, you're going to want to talk to the owner here. I said, here? She said, yeah, he's the chef, or he's the cook. I said, is he here now? She said, yeah. I said, would you have him come out here? She's like, yeah. So the cook came out. He's got his old white apron on and everything. And he sits at my table and he says, so you're here looking for Bigfoot, huh? And I said, yeah. I said, you got a story to tell me? He said, yeah. He said, I've lived here all my life. He said, when I was 12, he said, I was riding my bike by Stone Cold Creek or Cold Stone Creek or something like that. He said that they were riding bikes through the park, and they heard something trailing them in the brush. And so he gets up on the crest of the road crests, and he stops his bike and looks back, and this little one steps out on the road down behind him where it stepped out on the road. So they were being followed by one that was about their size, who was probably fascinated with them on these bicycles. And it actually stepped out, and he saw it, and he said it spooked him so bad that he did not go back to the park until he was a man. And so we were talking about stuff, and I said, so he said when he was in college, that's the next time that he went back there, when he was in college with some other friends and stuff. And he says they were camping. And so I was talking to him about Bigfoot behavior. I said, what do you know about Bigfoot behavior? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, they do things like throw rocks. And he's like, what? I said, yeah, they throw rocks a lot. And he was like, oh my God. He said, when I was with my friends at college age, he said, there was a stretch where we were getting hit with rocks. And when you're with college age dudes, you just know that it's one of the dudes doing it. There's no way you're thinking it's coming from me. So I was getting pissed at whoever was throwing the rocks wouldn't quit, wouldn't stop, and wouldn't reveal which one of the dudes was the ones throwing the rocks. It's just amazing. And the last time I was there was just like 3 years ago. A friend of mine went with me, and we just stopped there for one night. It was in February, but it was so bitterly cold. We only stayed for one night, and I had my thermal camera, and nothing happened. And so we went on down to the Kiamichi Mountains from there. So that was the last time I was there. And now that I've got this thermal drone, oh my God, Matt, I cannot wait to get back down into that park. I need to spend some time there with this technology, if they are still there. And I have no reason to believe that they won't be. I mean, what would drive them away if they've been comfortable for hundreds of years coming to this park and people haven't deterred them from coming there? So I can't wait to get down there.
I mean, I agree 100%. You know, lots of things have happened down there and they've remained down there. I have no reason to believe that they're not still there and not still following the same behavior patterns as much as they can. Obviously, one area of the park has kind of been entirely changed, so I don't expect them to be around there anymore. But as far as the other locations in the park, I've always thought it was just a matter of a person with enough time and the right technology being there to be able to get some really solid evidence, if not proof, that these things are there.
Right. So do you want to be on my short call list if something happens?
I do. I want to be that phone call you make where, hey, Matt, I'm looking at one on the thermal right now.
Yeah.
And I may be able to point out some little, hidey holes that you may not be aware of down there. Who knows?
Very good. Yes, I it's only going to take one. It's only going to take one good thermal video that shows locomotion and all kinds of aspects of what's going on that just can't be denied. So that's really my next goal. I mean, I don't know why I'm trying to prove to everybody else. I'm just fascinated with the chase. I've always been fascinated with just the mystery of it all, and I enjoy this process so much that I don't know what I'd do if I wasn't doing this. I would surely be wasting my time on something.
I mean, I think you're a lot like me. I'm not the type of person to walk away from a puzzle before I finished it. And
yes.
This puzzle isn't finished, not by a long shot.
Right. Well, I think we're going to get there. And man, I want somebody that, I mean, you think of people like John Green and Renee DeHinden and all of these older gentlemen who put their academic lives on the livelihood on the line, and and spend all this time chasing it and never even really had their own sightings, based on just footprints and stuff like that. So think of how many people, if we can just get that one thermal video that just can't be denied, are just going to finally have a big sigh of relief, that this is it.